This is a movie about the Messiah. It's about political figures becoming messianic figures. It's about political figures taking psychedelic journeys, right? Steve Jobs, right, writes in his autobiography that without taking a psychedelic journey, he couldn't have started Apple. And is Dune actually, stay close, an endorsement? Is it a recreation of the Messiah myth? Or is Dune a critique of Messiah? Right, and this is the code that we're going to use to kind of work through Dune, right? We need leaders. We need messiahs. We don't just need messiahs. Messiahs alone are dangerous. We need dharma and dialectical relationship to messiahs. Messiahs not in devotion to dharma always become corrupt. We need a world in which every man and every woman is literally a messiah. So, and we're going to refine this code together between this week and next week. But this is just to kind of get a kind of general, a sense of where we want to go. Okay, so are we ready to go? Who's ready? Who's ready? Are we ready? Who's ready to go? Okay, there's a big new world. Now, if you haven't seen Dune, that's fine. Okay, I want to ask you to try and see it this week. You can see it on HBO, I believe. You can see it in a theater, right? And to try and see it, not because you like the movie or don't like the movie, right? It's actually a pretty exciting cinematic experience, but you're seeing it because you're actually participating in the evolution of the source code of culture. Culture has put over the last 50, 60 years, this movie, it was in 1965 that it began, this movie into the center of culture. It's re-landed in the center of culture. It's going to be in the center for the next couple of years. Why? What's important about it? What's the yearning in it? What are the challenges in it? Where do we need to take it? Okay? Ready to go? Here we go. So let's begin our conversation around Dune. And I want to spend, maybe the first few minutes just kind of laying out, what is the movie about? And I by the way, just saw the movie, 2 days ago, and I had a kind of intense last 24 hours. And so I'm really just kind of thinking about it right now deeply. So this is a first take. So in we go, Dune. Okay. So one, we're in the middle of a series here in One Mountain about story and about how we work with story. So looking at this story, Dune, actually makes perfect sense in terms of the flow of conversation that we're involved in right now. Does that make sense, everyone? So we're now looking at a story and how to read a story and how to understand it through the prism, right, of first principles and first values. That's just the first step. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay, so that's one. So two, the story is written by Frank Herbert in 1965. I would guess, I don't have valid information on this. I don't think we have actual information, but I would guess, 95% that Herbert wrote a lot of the story while himself he was on psychedelics. But even if he didn't write the actual story on psychedelics, he had a serious psychedelic set of experiences. Psychedelics begin in America in earnest, 50, 60 years before, but they go through a new phase in the 50s, in the kind of beatnik generation in San Francisco, number one, right? And number two, right, they get restarted again in 62, 63 with my friend Richard Alpert, right, known as Ramdas, and his co-professor at Harvard, Timothy Leary, right, who began the LSD revolution. Okay, so the psychedelics kind of re-instantiate in the early 60s. They're going to really explode into culture like 67, and Herbert's writing in 65. That's just to kind of locate where we are. Okay, so that's number one. Okay, now number two, right? Number three, Herbert writes 4 or 5 books. He passes away. His son, Brian Herbert, continues to write. He writes with, I jotted down his name before. He writes with Kenneth or Kevin. Let me just find his name for a second. I jotted it down right before we started. Right, the young man, a very beautiful young man, who actually participated in the writing the Star Wars movie, Kevin J. Anderson. So Brian Herbert, right, the son of Frank Herbert, writes another series of prequels, right? In other words, meaning what happened before Dune started, how did the Emperor come to the throne, right, etc., and later sequels. So there's this huge kind of Dune world, this huge Dune enterprise. Now, I don't want to talk about particularly now, the influence of Dune on culture, which it did have, right? So, for example, it's a Messiah story. Is this gentleman who I'm going to talk about who he is, I'm going to give you the characters. So even if you haven't watched Dune, I'm going to give everyone the central cast of characters in a couple of seconds. But just little spoiler, Paul Atreides, right, who's the son of Duke Leto of the House of Atreides, right, in this future imperial world. Paul is the potential Messiah. And the question of the first movie and of the first Dune novel is he the one? Remember The Matrix? Neo? Same question, is he the one? And The Matrix is very much derivative, right, of Dune. Kevin J. Anderson, who works with Brian Herbert, Frank's son, on a whole nother set of Dune novels, also writes the basic Star Wars trilogy with George Lucas. So there's this Star Wars relationship. They're kind of happening at the same time. David Lynch, who directs the first attempt at a Dune movie, which doesn't go well in 1984, actually turns down making Return of the Jedi in order to make that movie. And I'm not interested in the historical issues here, just giving you a sense that this cast of characters making this movie are very integrally related to culture. And Dune was so iconic that an enormous amount of sci-fi afterwards was derivative. Now, science fiction matters because science fiction is both a way of expressing dystopian possibility. In other words, even before anyone had any idea about existential risk or was thinking about it seriously, existential risk appeared in two major places. It appeared in the great traditions as Apocalypse and Armageddon, number one. And number two, it appeared in sci-fi. Those were actually the two places that the dystopian possibility of existential risk appeared. What's new about contemporary existential risk is very fascinating and important. I don't want to talk about now. But just to understand, sci-fi is important. Sci-fi is also important for utopia. Sci-fi doesn't just generate Blade Runner and doesn't just generate Hunger Games, right? But sci-fi can also generate a utopian vision of the world, right? So you've got 1984, and then you've got B.F. Skinner, who writes a utopian novel, right, called Walden 2. Now, it's a very flawed utopia, right, as we've talked about in other conversations. But sci-fi can also generate, right, literature can also generate utopia, which is, of course, in the great traditions, not Armageddon, but the Messianic story, right? The Garden of Eden reinstantiated, right, reincarnated on earth is the Messianic story. So the Messiah story is the utopia story, right? And the Armageddon story is the existential risk dystopia story. And we have in sci-fi, right, both of these streams, both a utopian and a dystopian stream. And Dune is at least in part utopian, right? At least that's how it begins in a very, very strong way. Okay, and it'll get to, right, to dystopian possibilities. All right, so we getting the sense here? We getting the sense? And stay in, everybody. Stay in the order that we're going, okay? Don't jump. Stay close in the order, right? Let's unpack it step by step, okay? Let's keep going. Let's keep going. And again, if we don't unpack it step by step, we're just going to get a little piece there and a little piece there, okay? Let's go step by step. Let's be careful. So who are the figures? So one, we're in the far future. We have an imperial, this is all important to understand the story. We have an imperial feudal system. It's run by the empire, right? Dune has been seen by people as a critique of free market capitalism. It's not, right? There is no free market capitalism in Dune, right? It's a mercantile feudal system, right? In which politics runs the economy, which is one of the disasters in Dune. That's a very important thing to keep in mind. Politics runs the economy. All of the planets and their various economic enterprises are controlled by the emperor and given to or taken from the different houses, which are like the noble houses in the medieval period, right, by the king. So it's very much a feudal economic system at play. So the emperor is Shaddam IV, number one. Number two, right, there are, let's just kind of get a sense here, right? There are several groups of people at play. So there's the Space Guild, right? And the Space Guild are this group of, super mentats. And mentats are men who have become almost supercomputers. But be careful, artificial intelligence and supercomputers themselves are outlawed in this future world. Fascinating, right? So there's an early awareness in the mid-60s of their danger, but human beings, right, particularly in this case, men become mentats, right? They take on this capacity, right, of virtually the level of artificial intelligence supercomputers. And actually, one of the key character, Paul, has a dimension of mentat. He's been trained in some sense with some mentat capacity. So those are the mentats. Right? That's the kind of superhuman, right, on the male side, and particularly the men running the Space Guild, right, have particular powers. Those powers come from the spice. The spice is a psychedelic substance that both confers in each taking of the spice a different experience, and to each person has a different interaction with the spice, and a particular property of the spice that's been accessed by the mentats who are running the Space Guild, right, is instantaneous travel at an interstellar level. So the galaxy is opened up by interstellar travel, which is facilitated by what? Anybody? By the spice, right? By the psychedelic spice. Does everyone get that? That's one. So you've got the emperor, you've got the Space Guild, you've got the mentats, then you have the B'nai Gesserit. The B'nai Gesserit are who? Right? The B'nai Gesserit are the women, right, who are the women, not woman, the women, right, who are a mystical political guild, right, who have accessed the spice, right, to open up their own mystical powers. Those are the B'nai Gesserit, okay? Then you have, and you got to understand this architecture in order to be able to enter the story, right? Then you have the feudal houses themselves, which control different planets. And you have two major feudal houses at play here. And one is the Atreides. And the Atreides house is run by Duke Leto Atreides, okay? And his wife is Jessica. Jessica's actually not his wife, his concubine. And she's a B'nai Gesserit. And her mentor is the truth sayer to the emperor. She's kind of the mother superior of these B'nai Gesserit, these kind of mystical, sorcerer, politically adroit, magically, mystically powerful women. So Duke Leto of Atreides, head of the House of Atreides, comes together, doesn't marry Jessica. Before we get to their son Paul, who's the key player, there's the House of Harkonnen, which is the opposing house, the House of Harkonnen. Harkonnen is run by Vladimir Harkonnen and his two nephews. And Vladimir is this bloated, gluttonous figure. And within the context of feudal houses, because these are feudal houses, they're not democratic, right? But within the context of feudal houses, Leto is benevolent. He's a good man. Right? He's an ethical man, right? He knows how to wield power, right? He incarnates genuine goodness. Harkonnen are the villains, absolutely. And they are gluttonous, and they are the worst of, win-lose metrics, rivalrous conflict without first values and first principles, okay? And the structure of the story is when the emperor makes a big decision. What's the decision? So next piece of information. And you can't even begin without this, okay? So all the spice, which is the person who controls the spice controls the universe. The house that controls the spice controls the universe. The House of Harkonnen had controlled the spice. All the spice is located where? Anybody? And I want to write it in the chat box on Arrakis. Arrakis is the planet that holds the spice, the psychedelics. Arrakis is a desert planet, right? Completely inhospitable. And that desert planet and desert power is a very important theme. Desert power is a very important theme. That desert planet is inhabited by Arakkans who live in the city and Freemen who live in the desert. The Harkonnen report that there's about 50,000, right, Freemen, but actually there's millions of Freemen on the planet who've actually kind of melted into the desert. They're outlaws. And the feudal system forbids the Arakkan, right, or the Freemen from harvesting and selling the spice. They're not allowed to because it's a feudal economic system, which is a big part of the story. It's a feudal, and you need all this. To do any Dharma without this is absurd. We're just making stuff up. We're just doing New Age, right, or fundamentalism. And we got to actually get the story. Something's important here, okay? So the Freemen and the Arakkans are not allowed economically to harvest spice. So the only people that are allowed to harvest spice are the people that the feudal emperor, right, Shamat IV, right, has given permission, which is the House of Harkonnen. So the movie opens with the emperor taking away the license for the House of Harkonnen to harvest spice on Arrakis, which is the source of the Harkonnens' power, and giving that right to the House of Atreides. But of course, this is a Judas move. This is a betrayal, because great messianic stories always have a betrayal at the core of them. The emperor is actually afraid of Duke Leto of the House of Atreides, who's benevolent and popular, right, and a real leader. So he aligns behind the scenes with Vladimir Harkonnen, right, sends him his elite troops. They want to actually get all of the House of Atreides on Arrakis, away from their home planet of Caladan, where they're much more powerful, and destroy them. Right? That's what's happening. Leto knows it's a trap, and he goes anyways, thinking that he'll have time to actually, outwit and outsmart, right, the Emperor and Baron Harkonnen. Right? That's our story. A couple of things. So, and I want to we're just going to get started this week. We're just going to get started. Okay? We're just going to get started. So, and I want to, if we can, in this one mountain session, learn together how to read a story. I mean, I could just jump in and take a couple lines and talk about them, but that's not how you read a story of culture. You've got to read it carefully and understand what's happening, right? And unpack it step by step. So I want to just notice a couple of things here that are actually, complete invisible in the story. Let's just notice some themes. So the son of Jesse and Duke Leto of Atreides is Paul. Okay? Paul, of course, is also the first disciple, right? The most powerful disciple of the Christ figure. That's going to become important. And Jessica, who's of the B'nai Gesserit, which is this mystical political order of the feminine, Jessica is Paul's mother. So the mother-son nexus is very important. Does that make sense? That's always true in a messianic story. So you've got Mother Mary and Jesus. You have in the biblical story, Leah, who's the mother of Judah, which we talked about this summer, right, at our summer intensive. So Leah and Judah, mother, son, right? Mary and Jesus, right? Mother, son. So that's 2, right? 3, the B'nai Gesserit have the capacity to determine the sex of the child in the womb. There's a B'nai Gesserit secret tradition that at some point a Messiah figure will emerge, okay? And that Messiah figure, okay, that Messiah figure will emerge, they think, from Jessica's daughter. Jessica is instructed by the Mother Superior to have a son. She breaks that order. She's instructed to have a daughter. that daughter's supposed to birth Messiah, right? So it's a messianic story. And the sense that she can actually birth a son who will bring together the best of Duke Leto of Atreides' power gifts, right? His political gifts, his diplomatic gifts, and her mystical gifts, the feminine and the masculine together in a heros gamos, in this unique divine marriage in her son. That's what she wants to create in Paul. And so she believes that Paul is the one. Okay? Now there's a separate tradition in the Freeman people. Who are the Freeman people, friends? They live on Arrakis, and they have a separate tradition that also waits for the Messiah, and they call their Messiah Muad'Dib. Muad'Dib. And Muad'Dib means Messiah, right? Muad'Dib means Messiah. And when they meet Paul, they see signs based on their old prophecies that Paul is a Muad'Dib. Now, notice, this is very beautiful what Herbert's doing. What Herbert's doing is he's trying to intentionally bring together, just so you get a sense of how to read a story. And none of this appears in the commentary, of course, right, on Dune, at least as far as I've been able to look at it, in a couple hours of kind of searching different, readings. This is on, and none of this appears, what we're about to say, and it's completely interesting and completely beautiful. So notice the name, there's a particular name given in the novel, right, to the future Messiah. And the future Messiah is called, I'm going to ask someone to write this in the chat box, Kewitz, or I can write it in, if no one can write it in. Kewi, right? S-A-T-Z, thank you. And the second word, we can put those two words together. The second word is H-A-D-E-R-A-C-H. H-A-D, got that? H-A-D-E-R-A-C-H. Okay, fantastic. That's the name, right, in Dune, right, for the Messiah, who we think might be Paul. Now stay with me really closely. So Dune was deeply aware and deeply connected to both Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. So he names the Messiah Paul, because he doesn't want to be too obvious, right, to pick Christ, but Paul is a Christian name. But then the Freemen, who are clearly, kind of think Lawrence of Arabia desert, right? The Freemen are desert Arabs. Actually, it was filmed in Jordan. That's where they actually filmed it, because that's where the desert was most appropriate. But their vision of Paul is a Muad'Dib, which doesn't actually mean anything formal in Arabic, but he's clearly playing on Arabic, Muad'Dib, that's two. And then the word, right, let's go back to Kvitzat Haderach that you just wrote in, right, where it says Kiwizat Hadrach. So you're like, what does that mean? So that's something fascinating. So that actually is, and I don't know how Frank Herbert came across it, but that's actually a formal term in Kabbalah and Hasidism, which refers to the ability to do instantaneous travel between places. That's called Kvitzat Haderach. Kvitzat Haderach means instantaneous travel between places. And of course, what is the power that the spice allows the Space Guild, which opens up the Imperial Galaxy? Kvitzat Haderach. Instantaneous travel between spaces, between places. So that capacity is understood in Kabbalah as the capacity of the Messiah. So for example, in Kabbalah or in Hasidism particularly, there are stories of the founder of Hasidism that Buber wrote about, the Baal Shem Tov, who does Kvitzat Haderach, right? He does instantaneous travel, right, between places. Wow. Okay, so we're beginning to have something going on here. Okay, so he's taking this very, very esoteric, Kabbalistic Hebrew source. He's taking Muad'Dib of Islam. He's taking Paul, and he's bringing these together, right, in this vision of Messiah, right, in which the great traditions now come together, and it's a betrayal story. It's a betrayal story, right? The story revolves around betrayals, two betrayals. One betrayal by the emperor, right? The emperor betrays the house of Atreides, right? Duke Leto, right? And allies himself with the vicious Harkonnen. And number two, Within the House of Atreides, there's a doctor, Dr. Yu, Y-U-E-H, who's the close doctor, right? Very, very close to Duke Leto of Atreides and to Jessica, right? And to Paul, right? Whose wife is being held by the Harkonnen, who threatened to dismember her, to torture her. He's faced with an impossible decision, right? And he betrays, right, the House of Atreides, and yet helps Jessica and, right, the mother, right, and Paul escape, and puts a poison gas and an implanted tooth in a drugged Duke Leto, right, who's, you know, then given over to Baron Harkonnen, which he can use to try and kill Baron Harkonnen because it produces a poison gas. But in any case, he betrays. It doesn't work. Betrayal never works. Never works to betray, right? His wife is actually killed, right, and not freed, and he's killed. Okay, let me add one thing just so you get it. So in the Messianic tradition, the key name is Jesse, right? David, who's the father of Solomon in the original lineage of Messiah, right? The original Messiah figure is called Judah, right? In the book of Genesis, Judah is the original Messiah figure. He's born from the unique love of his mother, Leah, just like Paul Atreides is born by the unique love, right, of his mother, Jesse. Then in the line of Messiah, it goes from Judah, right, to a man named Jesse. Jesse's the father of David. You get that? Jesse is the source of the Messiah line in the mystical tradition. And so, of course, Jessica is the name. Jessica is Jesse. The B'nai Gesserit, right, alludes to this Judah line, this Judah messianic line. Okay, so we're clearly, right, in the Messiah conversation, right, in a very big way. Okay, does everyone got that? Does everyone got that? Was a lot. That was a lot. Does everyone got it? That was the frame. Okay? Now here's the thing. We haven't yet said anything. We've said absolutely nothing. Right? We've just set the context for having a conversation. Okay? We've just barely set the context to have a conversation. So what we're going to do is next week, we're going to send out, right, this 25 minutes, okay, so that people can have the basic context. And then we're going to have we should be blessed by spirit and by the politics of Eros, maybe the most exciting conversation we've ever had. There's a wildly exciting conversation about now that we have that context, what's the movie about? Right? What's actually happening here? What's actually important about this? Right? This is a movie about the Messiah. It's about political figures becoming messianic figures. It's about political figures taking psychedelic journeys. Right? Steve Jobs, right, writes in his autobiography that without taking a psychedelic journey, he couldn't have started Apple. John Mackey has spoken many times in public, my good friend, about, you know, the 30 acid trips that founded Whole Foods, right? So there's this notion of these political figures, right, accessing mystical power, becoming messianic figures. And yet, and let's go back to our code. Let's see if we can find the code. Let's go back to the code. What was our original code? Right? There's great promise in a Messiah figure and great danger in a Messiah figure. Paul Atreides, there's great promise in Paul Atreides. Right? He's got this incredible moment of destiny, and yet at the same time, he's a problematic figure. Right? Is Messiah the path to the future? And is Dune actually, stay close, an endorsement? Is it a recreation of the Messiah myth? Or is Dune a critique of Messiah? And what does it mean, right, to move from having the singular one Messiah to a democratization of enlightenment, right, to unique self as Messiah? What does it mean to democratize the idea of the Messiah? And how would that work? And what's the relationship between psychedelic and Messiah and politics and economic structures, right? These are all critical issues. And what we're going to see is there's actually 5 critical themes that are needed to actually create the evolution of the source code, the evolution of culture and consciousness, to tell the new story. And actually, Dune is playing with all 5 of those themes, sometimes precisely right and sometimes precisely wrong. But we're actually going to use the movie Dune to try and articulate next week what are the 5 components that we need to create the future. What are the 5 components of the new story? And we're going to use the Dune conversation, right, as a backdrop for that conversation. Who is Paul Atreides? Right? What is going to be gorgeous about him? Right? What's going to be important about him? What's going to be flawed? What's going to be his future generations? Right? Who is his mother? What's wildly important about her? Right? We're going to look at the incredibly wild story next week, kind of insanely exciting. Okay? But what I want to do is kind of invite everyone, just listen to this introduction, so we'll have it. And then we're going to really hit our code big time. And I'm going to come into next week and I'm not going to recapitulate any of this. Right? So we're going to send out a few times this week so that people will have both watched the movie and seen the beginning, right, of this week. And then we're going to dive directly in and have, I hope, right, with the blessing of the House of Atreides, right, a fantastic and blow away week, right? But it's not just, we're not just having great fun, although it's going to be great fun. But actually, we're doing something very, very serious, which is we're doing a political, moral, spiritual, meditative act. And that is, we're going to actually look at a text of culture and look at it carefully. Now, believe me, friends, we could have taken any quote and talked about the quote and had a great conversation, but that's not real. We have to actually get a sense of, there's a structure, there's a context to the story. And then I want to kind of practice together, right, patience. Let's be kind of diligent, let's be rigorous, and then let's be ecstatic, then let's blow it away. So I wanted just to spend today, right, this is what we have to do. We got to see the figures. We got to see the players. I invite everyone to watch the movie once or twice this week, right? And then we'll dive in next week and try and see, right, where we're going to see in this, the analysis of this text of culture is the 5 pillars of the new society. What are the 5 pillars of the new story? What are the 5 pillars of the new society? And all of them are at play, right, in Dune.